I'm Scott with BibleStudying.net. We've been doing a study here on the canonization of the New Testament. At this point, we're talking about indications from the New Testament itself that the apostles were involved in the collection and authorizing of the specific 27 books of the New Testament, to put them together for the church after their deaths to use as a canon for truth and refuting false teaching. And so we talked about Peter and his epistle, and now we're going to move on to talking about Paul and John. And so we'll start with John, and we're going to read several quotes from his epistles here. And what we're going to call attention to is that he writes of his involvement with others in the recording and collection of Christ's teaching. That's kind of what Peter was doing in his epistle. John also appeals to the their authority to do so because they were eyewitnesses. Again, this is placing the idea of the authorization of the New Testament as a collection because by men who had the authority because they were eyewitnesses to the things that they had seen. And then John is also aware, as we'll see it from Revelation, of a need to distribute the writings throughout the churches, which is something that we see already happening by the beginning of the 2nd century. The churches already seem to have the collection of the New Testament works, as exhibited by Polycarp and Ignatius and others. So here's John in the end of his gospel. He says, "This is the disciple which testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. There are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written." But of course we do have 27 books recording these things for us. And this is sort of an awareness being stated here in John's gospel, that he was working with people, eyewitnesses, who were capable of doing this, and chief among them at that point being John. In his first epistle, John says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, and we have looked on, and we have seen it and bear witness. That which we have seen and heard we declare unto you." And then he says, "These things we write unto you." This is the message we have heard from him and declare unto you. This awareness that he needed to do this, that the eyewitnesses needed to do this, that they were the authority to do this. They had been eyewitnesses, and they were going to write these things down and declare them. And he's writing about this in a very small epistle. Obviously, he's talking about larger works communicating to the New Testament teachings of Jesus to the church. In 3 John, he similarly says, "We also bear record that you know, and you know that our record is true." In Revelation 1, John being described here receiving the revelation from Jesus Christ in verse 1, from the angel, let's say, and then from Jesus, who got it from God. And then verse 2, it says of John, "who bore record of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ." And that's talking about John and in his writing of the gospel, his writing down in the book of Revelation, and the need for him to record these things and pass that on. Revelation 1:11, talking about the idea of distribution, is where John is being told by Jesus to take what he's about to see, to write it in a book, and to send it to the 7 churches. They were obviously aware at this point of the need to distribute this material for preservation of the church. So let's look at Paul. Paul, like Peter, knows that he's about to die. He writes that here. We're going to look at 2 Timothy 4. So he knows he's about to die, and he's talking about something he's working on. And here what we're going to see in 2 Timothy 4 is that that Paul, Luke, Timothy, and Mark were together in Rome before Paul's death, and they were involved in some effort involving the collection of books and parchments. So that's pretty important. We have to ask ourselves, when did the 27 books of the New Testament get collected? We saw from Peter's epistle that he has an awareness of all of Paul's letters, indicating maybe that Paul's collection of Paul's letters had already occurred. So here in 2 Timothy, we have Paul saying in verse 6, "For now I am ready to be offered, and that the time of my departure is at hand." So he's aware of his impending death. And then in verse 9 he says to Timothy, "Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me." Verse 11, "Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with you, for he is profitable to me for the ministry." And then in verse 13 he says, "Bring with you and the books, but especially the parchments, and do thy diligence to come before winter." So this explains, imagining that we have Paul and Luke and Mark and Timothy, all these authors of the New Testament with the exception of Timothy, gathering together before Paul dies with a collection of important books and parchments. What are they doing? Well, it's not hard to imagine that they might have been collecting at least Paul's works, maybe Luke's work, maybe Mark's work at that point. That would have been a large body of the New Testament documents. And this would explain why Peter maybe had a copy of all of Paul's letters, because Peter explains to us in his first epistle that Mark was with him. So maybe Mark went with Timothy to Rome with Paul and Luke are there, and they get together and they put the writings of Paul together, and then they take copies of everything to Peter. So there seems to be possibly up to 3 collections of the New Testament books by the apostles. They all lived, they all died at different times, they all wrote at different times, and it seems to be there was initially one done by Luke, Paul, Timothy, and Mark, very possibly indicated there by 2 Timothy, in which 17 books of the New Testament may have been present. That is all of Paul's letters, Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts, and then Mark's Gospel. And then possibly a second collection done by Peter, adding his 2 epistles. Maybe at that time he and Mark may have worked out the Gospel of Mark, which we're told by the early church was in fact Peter's record of Jesus' teachings and Jesus' ministry. And then it's possible that at that point it was that Matthew, James, and Jude's work was added. All 3 men lived in Jerusalem with Peter for the most of their lives. All 3 wrote their work, their contributions to the New Testament before Peter died, and so it's very possible that he got them at that point and incorporated them. And then finally by John and other men in Ephesus, and we'll fill in some details there. John and Timothy both died in Ephesus at about 98 AD. The historical documents of the early church tell us that. And what we can learn from these historical documents of the early church is that it's at that time that John adds his 3 epistles, writes the gospel, and writes the book of Revelation, which seems to be what Revelation is talking about. And so here's some quotes. Britannica says, at the end of the 2nd century, Polycrates, the bishop of Ephesus, claims that John's tomb is there, that John died in Ephesus is also stated by Irenaeus, who said that John wrote his gospel and his letters at Ephesus. And of course he wrote Revelation while he was at Patmos. This is from Irenaeus. He says, John, the disciple of the Lord, did himself publish a gospel during his residence in Ephesus. And then this is from the Moratorian Canon. It says about what was going on there in Ephesus. The 4th of the Gospels is that of John. His fellow disciples and bishops who had been urging him to write there at Ephesus. And then he tells them, let's fast, and then we'll put all these things together and then and record this. And Andrew, one of the apostles, so Andrew's alive and is there with them, says that John should write down all of these things that they could remember as eyewitnesses, and that they would publish it as a gospel. And so this seems to be what happened, the final collection of the New Testament, very possibly occurring there in Ephesus in 90 AD under John the Apostle, Timothy, having the collections done earlier possibly by Peter, by Paul and Luke, Timothy, and Mark there in Rome before Paul's death, and then by the whatever remaining witnesses. As Paul says, there were 500 witnesses of Christ that were alive, according to 1 Corinthians 15. Some of these men, maybe they're working with John and Timothy in Ephesus to collect the New Testament, and they collect it and then they distribute it to the church. And this would explain why men like Polycarp and Ignatius have it. They were appointed bishops by John, and they were there near Ephesus in Asia Minor. So apparently maybe the New Testament collection that occurred by John and Timothy there at Ephesus began to be distributed out to the church at that point around 100 AD. And that's why we have it in the early church in the 2nd century, early in the 2nd century. So just some final conclusions here. There's good biblical and historical reason to conclude that the New Testament itself was collected, all 27 books, authorized by the apostles in the apostolic period by the close of the 1st century, and it was not left to the later church to sort of cobble these works together and say, no, this is the list. It seems the apostles did that. There are biblical information to confirm that, and the historical documents from the church in the 2nd century warrant that we look for an early canonization and collection of the New Testament. And then we have some explanation there of why it was necessary for the 4th century church to make, let's say, a redeclaration of the New Testament books, because the heretics, as we know from the 2nd century, had begun to remove books and had begun to edit certain books and take portions out of them. So after 200 years of that going on, the church leadership and the councils and in Athanasius had to come forward and say, this is the list that has always been passed down. And so that's sort of where we hear apologists today saying that the 4th century church merely reaffirmed or officially made a declaration of what had always been known in the church. So that's the extent of our study. We hope you enjoyed it. There's more material about this, more details and more paperwork on it on our website at BibleStudying.net. We hope to see you next time.